Hey guys, I know it's been a minute. I've been in solitary writing mode. An essay I published this morning about a shower thought I had, and let me just dive into it. So if a woman declines to have casual intimacy on the grounds that her faith forbids it, she's usually dismissed as naive or repressed. But if she refuses because it would make her feel empty or because it would undermine her ability to pair bond in the future, then she's met with understanding. Now, even though the underlying feeling for both women is the same, that they would feel bad doing it, our cultural sensibilities dictate that only one justification be taken seriously. Now, what conclusions can we draw from this observation? Well, the first and most obvious is that in a psychological age, religious reasons don't count as reasons at all. The same intuition that casual intimacy is bad for me becomes acceptable only when it's translated into psychological terms. She can speak of mental health, but she can't speak of morality or spirituality. Moral and spiritual intuitions must first pass through the toll booth of psychology before they are granted safe passage into discourse. And this happens commonly. People will understand if I quit drinking for my health, but it's weird if I say it's because it affects my ability to pray. So we have to code switch into psychological language to be taken seriously. We have to talk about it being better for our mental health instead of our virtue, better for our discipline instead of our faith. It's to avoid trauma rather than shame. But there are two other points worth exploring. So the way we frame our struggles often shape how we respond to them. When moral language is abandoned in favor of purely psychological explanations, something vital is lost, not just in our understanding of ourselves, but in our ability to affect change. For many people, moral and religious language provides a much more effective heuristic for self-improvement than the often sterile terminology of psychology. Moral language carries a weight and a demand for personal accountability that psychological framing often lacks. So the adulterer is not acting wickedly, he struggles with impulse control. The liar is not dishonest, he has unresolved trauma. The coward is not weak, he suffers from anxiety. But a thief who sees his theft as compulsive behavior will feel less urgency to reform than one who sees himself just plainly as a thief. A man who cheats on his wife because of attachment issues need not see himself as a wicked betrayer. Rather, he is a troubled psyche in need of understanding. If every moral failing is cast in the language of dysfunction rather than transgression, the impulse to change weakens. In the worst cases, moral resolve gives way to passive acceptance of one's condition as an unfortunate but inevitable aspect of the self. Prison psychiatrist Theodore Dalrymple wrote a sharp polemic on this phenomenon called Admirable Evasions, in which he argues that psychology often undermines morality. He writes, "If someone admits to unhappiness, it might be that his own ill conduct, foolish or immoral, has contributed to it. But if he is depressed, he is the victim of an illness, of something which, metaphysically speaking, has fallen from the sky. This can make of the person an object rather than a subject." Now, of course, there are some people who suffer genuine physiological or psychological illnesses that make self-development, moral self-development, difficult. In such cases, psychotherapy, medication, or other medical interventions might be necessary to manage symptoms and establish a foundation of health. However, once the medical problem is treated, the moral problem of cultivating good character still remains. The moral tests of life never go away. Moral language as an evocative force that psychological language lacks. To say a man has betrayed his soul conveys a gravity, a finality, a call to reckoning that anxious coping mechanism simply does not. A society that ceases to speak in terms of mission and purpose, virtue and vice, right and wrong, is a society that forfeits the ability to inspire, to stir people to greatness, to call them to account. In our well-intentioned attempt to avoid the harshness of moral language, we might have abandoned one of the most powerful tools for human transformation. Aristotle recognizes this point in his Ethics. He tells us not to listen to people who say, "You're just a human, think like a human. You're just a mortal, so think like a mortal." Instead, try to connect with the highest and most divine part of yourself, that part that reflects wisdom and greatness. Even if it's a small part of who you are, it has far more power and value than anything else in you. William James has a great line on this as well. He says, "When other people criticize our own more exalted soul flights by calling them nothing but expressions of our organic disposition, we feel outraged and hurt. For we know that whatever be our organism's peculiarities, our mental states have their substantial value as revelations of the living truth. And we wish that all this medical materialism could be made to hold its tongue." Now, I'm not here arguing that moral or religious frameworks are superior to psychological ones as tools for self-knowledge. My point is that psychology is having a linguistic monopoly over our moral discourse that is existentially impoverishing. We lose something profound when grave moral language, words that have stirred the human conscience for millennia, is cast aside in favor of terminology that reduces any human failing to clinical dysfunctions. Okay, now the second section or comment. It's common to talk about people who cleave to irrational prejudices under the guise of deeply held intuition or belief, like religious zealots. But we don't talk enough about the domain of legitimate moral intuition that is beyond the reach of mere reasoning. Human beings don't construct their lives from first principles. We rarely choose our values and commitments. Rather, we intuitively apprehend and care about certain things, and then, if required, furnish them with justifications. We know before we can explain, and often the demand that we explain ourselves forces us into a labyrinth of unnecessary and potentially dangerous rationalizations. William James, in his legendary The Will to Believe in 1896, argues that many of our core beliefs are not a product of detached rational deliberation, but arise as lived convictions shaped by experience and necessity. They're part of a pre-theoretical existential framework by which we orient ourselves in the world. And many of our deepest convictions are not believed, they're lived. They're woven into the fabric of our experience in such a way that their loss would actually constitute a kind of personal collapse. And yet today, many operate under the intellectualist error that all beliefs must be justified according to certain rationalistic criteria, or else be relinquished as superstition. This error fundamentally misrepresents the nature of belief, and there's a great danger in questioning one's moral intuition because it fails to satisfy the demands of a narrow rationalism. If a woman learns that her moral aversion to casual intimacy is not taken seriously because it doesn't conform to contemporary social or rationalistic standards, she might come to believe that all her moral intuitions are unreliable. She might be discarding genuine moral knowledge in the risky pursuit of a more rational foundation. And if she continues down this road of self-doubt and revision, she might find that she no longer recognizes herself, and what once stood firm within her, a source of inner light and certainty about things, is now a shifting haze of competing voices, none of which she can call her own. She will have absorbed too many foreign justifications and borrowed too many provisional identities, until she is no longer the author of her own convictions, but a mere custodian of other people's reasoning. And in a kind of final moment, when she reaches for certainty but finds nothing but a hollowed out core, she will understand too late that by seeking justification palatable to others, she has forfeited the only justification that ever truly mattered, which was her own.